Well, ahead of this announcement that we're going to take you to live any moment, we are getting reports that the Trump administration officials are telling members of Congress that the United States is withdrawing from the Iran nuclear accord. TRT World's White House correspondent Tatiana Anderson is in Washington for us. Tatiana, what are you hearing?
Yeah, exactly that telephone calls are being made from the White House to members of Congress, and that everyone expects President Trump to pull out of this deal. For a long time, President Trump wasn't giving any signals about what he was going to do. We were expecting actually all of this news to happen on Friday ahead of that May 12th deadline. But just yesterday, the president announcing via Twitter that he would announce his decision, that decision coming today, and in fact, that decision coming at some point this hour. We are waiting for the president to take the podium inside the White House. But out in front of the White House, I am joined by Alex Titus. He is a policy advisor at America First Policies, and it's the principal outside agency that is backing President Donald Trump's America First agenda. And I know Alex has a lot of perspective on what's going on here today. Alex, let's start with the idea that the president has a lot of problems with the JCPOA. He says that it's allowing Iran to gain an even greater foothold in places like Iraq, Syria, Yemen. It's allowing that nation to foment terrorism. He's got a problem with these sunset clauses that are a part of the JCPOA as well, saying that it's silly for these things to expire because that just opens the door for Iran to continue its nuclear program. But what about his plan for after? We haven't heard a lot about his solutions to some of these problems.
You're right, and we're still waiting for the president's announcement to actually happen in terms of there's not a single way to leave this deal as it currently is. And different analysts have pointed to there could be what's called a soft exit, which could be that sanctions will be coming on specific Iranian entities, but other sanctions will actually be delayed for a longer period of time, which could take up to 6 months and up to a year, actually, with what that soft exit would entail for the president. Then there could be what's called a hard exit from the deal, which would be that President Trump would impose sanctions immediately on the Iranian central bank, their exports of gas, and then the 400 Iranian companies that were actually signaled out with the previous sanctions, what the deal had taken away previously. So the president has plenty of options here. And he made very clear, as we were talking about a little bit earlier, that since 2015 he has ran against this deal, and he's called it one of the worst foreign policy decisions that the United States has ever taken place in. And I think with some of the issues we were talking about earlier, the president has laid out a strategy, but it'll be really interesting to hear actually during his announcement of where we plan to go from here on this deal and what type of exit will actually take place. And
you mentioned the word strategy, and we've heard a lot about that from President Donald Trump. He ran on this whole America First agenda, which is something I know your organization backs. He ran on the idea that he was going to dismantle a lot of Obama-era policies. The JCPOA is probably the signature legacy that President Obama has left behind. We've seen President Trump do away with Obamacare, back out of the climate change accord. How much of President Trump's signaling that he's going to be backing out of the JCPOA is really him appealing to his base and fulfilling a promise that he made along the campaign trail before he even got to the presidency?
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely going to be a promise fulfilled, as the president likes to say, promises made, promises kept. And this is one issue that the president had talked about even before he was running for the Republican primary, that the Iranian nuclear deal was one of the worst decisions in history and that he was strongly opposed to it. Now, in terms of what this deal will actually entail for his base, there's been a lot of polls coming out lately which sort of both sides of the conversation have been using to back either an exit or back staying in the deal. And Republican primary voters definitely support the president pulling out of the deal in its current form by pretty large numbers, and that has diminished a little bit, but it's still pretty strong. And I think that you'll see the president deliver actually what he'll put forward as a strategy in terms of dealing with Iran. But the strategy which he has dealt with the rest of the region has been laid out. We've strengthened the alliances with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in terms to combat Iran and Yemen and deal with some of their radical Islamic terrorism in the state of Syria. And we've also strengthened our alliance with Israel as a fact. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of this announcement from the president and sort of what the path that he'll lay out forward on the Iranian nuclear deal is.
This is also something that former Obama-era policy advisors have been talking about today as well. Wendy Sherman and Tony Blinken, Tony Blinken was the deputy head of national security, and Wendy Sherman served in the Obama State Department. They came out today basically saying if the president does pull out of this deal, it worsens relations in the Middle East. It leaves avenues where U.S. troops could be put at risk. It prevents Americans who are being held in Iran from potentially being able to come home. From their perspective, the rewards aren't worth the risks. How do you counter that?
There definitely is going to be some trade-offs with this. There's not a consequence-free decision here, whether the president decides to stay in the deal, which is contrary to what we've heard, or whether he decides to do the hard or soft exit, depending on what he announces later. But in terms of that's potentially just some of the consequences and sacrifices that will have to be made. And I know that folks have been pointing to a lot of our allies being in opposition to the president's pullout, including some of our European allies, but they also fail to bring in our conversation of our Middle Eastern allies in terms of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has been a very strong advocate for the U.S. to either fix the deal heavily or nix it. And I'm sure you'll be hearing some cheers in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and then Bahrain as well, that the president has decided to take a strong stand of what he considers something not only to be harmful to the United States, but also to be harmful to our allies that are actually in that region. So I think that's a voice that's been left out of the conversation a lot, and that too much of the focus has been the reaction of sort of the allies that actually took place in the deal and not the allies that have had to deal with the tremendous consequences with the spread of Iranian proxy groups on their border, the situation that we have in Syria, and then all the other sort of craziness and instability that's been plaguing the region.
The JCPOA doesn't necessarily address some of the concerns that the president has in the first place. I mean, if you do away with the JCPOA, there are certain sanctions still left in place, namely the whole idea that U.S. sanctions do continue to prevent Iran from supporting terrorism, from supporting, not supporting human rights and creating human rights abuses. These other sanctions pretty much also address missile activity. So explain why it's such an important idea to do away with this deal that the president doesn't like when there are still sanctions left in place that actually address some of the areas that he's concerned about.
Yeah, so I think that one of the biggest concerns is just the cash influx that came as a result of the deal. We saw at least $100 billion come back to the Iranian regime of money, which was their assets that was frozen up before. And some experts actually estimate that number to be around $150 billion, which would be an astounding amount of money to sort of come back to, frankly, any country at an immediate time. And I think a lot of the premises of what this deal was built on was that Iran would use a lot of this money for economic development. They would use this money to help advance their own people. And, you know, and the Iranian people have legitimate concerns. We've seen protests just today, actually, of labor activists who have failed to have been paid from government jobs. They want to get rid of some of this corruption. And I think a lot of the money, which is really concerning, is that it's not actually being spent to advance the Iranian people. It's being spent to promote terrorist activities and promote instability in Yemen and the bloodshed in Syria and the development of some of these intercontinental missile ballistic programs, which the United States is a serious threat to itself, its allies in the region, and its allies in Europe as well. So those are just a few of the main concerns that the president does have with it.
And he will be addressing them shortly when he takes the podium in the White House. Alex, thank you very much for joining us. Jamie, I want to go back to you. I'm not sure if the president is about to take the podium or not, but we'll send it back to you.
Tatiana Anderson, for the moment, thank you very much. And I promise you, we will go straight back to Washington just as soon as we have a word on President Trump, who is about, even as I speak, to walk out to address the correspondents at the White House. Here we go.
My fellow Americans, today I want to update the world on our efforts to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. The Iranian regime is the leading state sponsor of terror. It exports dangerous missiles, fuels conflicts across the Middle East, and supports terrorist proxies and militias such as Hezbollah, Hamas, the Taliban, and al-Qaeda. Over the years, Iran and its proxies have bombed American embassies and military installations, murdered hundreds of American service members, and kidnapped, imprisoned, and tortured American citizens. The Iranian regime has funded its long reign of chaos and terror by plundering the wealth of its own people. No action taken by the regime has been more dangerous than its pursuit of nuclear weapons and the means of delivering them. In 2015, the previous administration joined with other nations in a deal regarding Iran's nuclear program. This agreement was known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. In theory, the so-called Iran deal was supposed to protect the United States and our allies from the lunacy of an Iranian nuclear bomb, a weapon that will only endanger the survival of the Iranian regime. In fact, the deal allowed Iran to continue enriching uranium and, over time, reach the brink of a nuclear breakout. The deal lifted crippling economic sanctions on Iran in exchange for very weak limits on the regime's nuclear activity and no limits at all on its other malign behavior, including its sinister activities in Syria, Yemen, and other places all around the world. In other words, at the point when the United States had maximum leverage, this disastrous deal gave this regime, and it's a regime of great terror, many billions of dollars, some of it in actual cash. A great embarrassment to me as a citizen and to all citizens of the United States. A constructive deal could easily have been struck at the time, but it wasn't. At the heart of the Iran deal was a giant fiction that a murderous regime desired only a peaceful nuclear energy program. Today, we have definitive proof that this Iranian promise was a lie. Last week, Israel published intelligence documents long concealed by Iran, conclusively showing the Iranian regime and its history of pursuing nuclear weapons. The fact is, this was a horrible, one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made. It didn't bring calm, it didn't bring peace, and it never will. In the years since the deal was reached, Iran's military budget has grown by almost 40%, while its economy is doing very badly. After the sanctions were lifted, the dictatorship used its new funds to build nuclear-capable missiles, support terrorism, and cause havoc throughout the Middle East and beyond. The agreement was so poorly negotiated that even if Iran fully complies, the regime can still be on the verge of a nuclear breakout in just a short period of time. The deal's sunset provisions are totally unacceptable. If I allowed this deal to stand, there would soon be a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Everyone would want their weapons ready by the time Iran had theirs. Making matters worse, the deal's inspection provisions lack adequate mechanisms to prevent, detect, and punish cheating, and don't even have the unqualified right to inspect many important locations, including military facilities. Not only does the deal fail to halt Iran's nuclear ambitions, but it also fails to address the regime's development of ballistic missiles that could deliver nuclear warheads. Finally, the deal does nothing to constrain Iran's destabilizing activities, including its support for terrorism. Since the agreement, Iran's bloody ambitions have grown only more brazen. In light of these glaring flaws, I announced last October that the Iran deal must either be renegotiated or terminated. 3 months later, on January 12th, I repeated these conditions, I made clear that if the deal could not be fixed, the United States would no longer be a party to the agreement. Over the past few months, we have engaged extensively with our allies and partners around the world, including France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. We have also consulted with our friends from across the Middle East. We are unified in our understanding of the threat and in our conviction that Iran must never acquire a nuclear weapon. After these consultations, it is clear to me that we cannot prevent an Iranian nuclear bomb under the decaying and rotten structure of the current agreement. The Iran deal is defective at its core. If we do nothing, we know exactly what will happen. In just a short period of time, the world's leading state sponsor of terror will be on the cusp of acquiring the world's most dangerous weapons. Therefore, I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. In a few moments, I will sign a presidential memorandum to begin reinstating U.S. nuclear sanctions on the Iranian regime. We will be instituting the highest level of economic sanction. Any nation that helps Iran in its quest for nuclear weapons could also be strongly sanctioned by the United States. America will not be held hostage to nuclear blackmail. We will not allow American cities to be threatened with destruction, and we will not allow a regime that chants death to America to gain access to the most deadly weapons on earth. Today's action sends a critical message. The United States no longer makes empty threats. When I make promises, I keep them. In fact, at this very moment, Secretary Pompeo is on his way to North Korea in preparation for my upcoming meeting with Kim Jong-un. Plans are being made, relationships are building. Hopefully a deal will happen, and with the help of China, South Korea, and Japan, a future of great prosperity and security can be achieved for everyone. As we exit the Iran deal, we will be working with our allies to find a real, comprehensive, and lasting solution to the Iranian nuclear threat. This will include efforts to eliminate the threat of Iran's ballistic missile program, to stop its terrorist activities worldwide, and to block its menacing activity across the Middle East. In the meantime, powerful sanctions will go into full effect. If the regime continues its nuclear aspirations, it will have bigger problems than it has ever had before. Finally, I want to deliver a message to the long-suffering people of Iran. The people of America stand with you. It has now been almost 40 years since this dictatorship seized power and took a proud nation hostage. Most of Iran's 80 million citizens have sadly never known an Iran that prospered in peace with its neighbors and commanded the admiration of the world. But the future of Iran belongs to its people. They are the rightful heirs to a rich culture and an ancient land, and they deserve a nation that does justice to their dreams, honor to their history, and glory to God. Iran's leaders will naturally say that they refuse to negotiate a new deal. They refuse, and that's fine. I'd probably say the same thing if I was in their position. But the fact is, they are going to want to make a new and lasting deal, one that benefits all of Iran and the Iranian people. When they do, I am ready, willing, and able. Great things can happen for Iran, and great things can happen for the peace and stability that we all want in the Middle East. There has been enough suffering, death, and destruction. Let it end now. Thank you. God bless you. Thank you.
You've been watching live coverage of US President Donald Trump speaking at the White House in Washington in the last few minutes, where he has formally announced US withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement. He said that the Iranian regime is the leading state sponsor of terrorism. He referred to President Obama's administration, who in 2015 signed the Iran nuclear deal, intended to protect the world, of course. That deal lifted economic sanctions. President Trump went on to say that he was dealing with a murderous regime and that his administration had definitive proof that Iran had been in breach, as he said, of that agreement. He referred to the Israel press conference last week of the publication of evidence of Iran's violations of the agreements. Let's listen in once again to the questions from journalists in the White House.
Everything is picked, and we look forward to have a very great success. We think relationships are building with North Korea. We'll see how it all works out. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But it can be a great thing for North Korea, South Korea, Japan, and the entire world. We hope it all works out. Thank you very much.
Are the Americans being free? Are the Americans being free?
We'll all soon be finding out. We will soon be finding out. It would be a great thing if they are. We'll soon be finding out. Thank you very much.
Why not just send North Korea, Mr. President?
Well, President Trump not staying around very long to answer journalist questions, and he tends not to linger to take too many questions after statements like this. But it is a very, very significant statement indeed, and you've heard it here on TRT World Live. US President Donald Trump, if you've just joined us, has announced in the last few minutes that the United States is withdrawing from the landmark Iran nuclear deal. The international accord, of course, limits Iran's nuclear capabilities in return for easing economic sanctions. European leaders wanted this deal to continue, of course. The former US Secretary of State John Kerry, who negotiated the original agreement on behalf of the United States, said it just does not make sense to abandon this deal. But Trump, of course, for months and months, right back to the US election campaign, always said repeatedly that this was the worst deal ever. And there, you've seen it live, he has now formally withdrawn the United States from the Iran nuclear deal. I think now we're going to return to TRT World's White House correspondent, Tatiana Anderson, who's in Washington for us. Tatiana, it's very easy to watch all of this and think, well, so what? This is just a story about Iran. But of course, it has profound consequences far beyond the region, doesn't it? For oil prices, for the aerospace industry, thousands of jobs, world security, and for anyone on earth who does business or who was doing business with Iran, who might continue to want to do so, because America, by the look of it, probably won't allow that to happen.
That's absolutely right, and you saw President Trump exit that room so quickly because he said he was going to sign in order to make all of this official, him saying that we are going to be instituting here in the United States some of the toughest economic sanctions against Iran in history. He said that this is an era where the United States no longer makes empty threats. He's saying that this Iran deal from the beginning was a bad deal. Since its implementation, he said that Iran's military budget grew by some 40%. He said that that nation's ability to foment terrorism in the Middle East and beyond has bloomed dramatically. And he also said that these sunset provisions that were in the JCPOA were totally unacceptable and could potentially start an arms race. But Donald Trump certainly walking back one of President Barack Obama's signature pieces of his own presidential history. You saw President Trump do that right there. For some more perspective on this, I do want to bring back Alex Titus. He is a policy advisor at America First Policies. Again, it's one of the principal outside groups that is backing President Donald Trump's America First agenda. And Alex, you listened to this just like I did. The president going to sign this executive order immediately, all of this taking place immediately. How is this not a win for Iran? I mean, you've got the United States basically turning its back on all of its allies to make this move. How is this not a win for Iran?
Well, the Iranian president actually just said yesterday that Iran would be majorly hurt if the United States decided to pull out, but that they would be, well, he's telling this to a group of Iranian citizens, that they would be fine and they likely would stay in the deal with the European powers, actually, which are still participating. But this might be, even if some may consider it a win in some ways to Iran, this is a humongous win for the United States and for the president in general. We're going to impose the harshest sanctions, as you just heard from the president, on the Iranian central bank, on Iranian oil companies, on businesses that do commerce with this regime, which is the largest sponsor of state terrorism across the entire world, and is frankly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and the displacement of millions of people. So I don't really understand where some could consider this a win for the win for Iran. This is a big win, though, for America and for our Middle East allies in the region.
What about the fact that some of President Trump's closest advisors I'm just getting news that President Netanyahu is speaking, so we're going to go listen to what he has to say.
Israel thinks that President Trump did an historic move. And this is why Israel thanks President Trump for his courageous leadership, his commitment to confront the terrorist regime in Tehran, and his commitment to ensure that Iran never gets nuclear weapons. Not today, not in a decade, not ever. Thank you.